to the Property Damage Podcast series on the issue of flooding. I'm Oliver Phillips, an associate here at BLM, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Laura Hughes, manager of the General Insurance team at the Association of British Insurers, and Paul Reddington, major loss property claims manager at Zurich Insurance. Today, we're going to be looking at the problems that flooding currently poses to the UK in comparison with where it sits on the national agenda, how much of a problem flooding will pose in the future, and what solutions may be available to mitigate flood risk. Welcome, Laura and Paul, to the podcast series. Just to give our discussion today a bit of context, I'd like to start by highlighting some flood statistics. To use some of the Environment Agency's statistics, 1 in 6 properties in the UK are at flood risk. That equates to 5.4 million homes and businesses. The cost to insurers of weather events in 2020 is approaching £1 billion. And I've also heard recently that as many as 40% of businesses fail following a flood event. Having heard those ominous statistics, Laura and Paul, what are you seeing in terms of flood risk? To what extent is flood risk a problem for insurers and their customers?
Thanks. Flooding is the greatest natural disaster risk in the UK, and I think those stats certainly highlight the stark reality that we're facing. Sadly, insurers are really well versed at responding to major floods, and it's really a priority area for them to make sure that they are there on the ground and supporting those who have experienced such a devastating event to get their lives back on track. So it's a huge problem for insurers, and they're there to support their customers every step of the way. What we have known in the past is historically there was a bit of a market failure in the lack of affordable and available flood insurance for households in the UK. So the industry's worked with government to create a scheme called Flood Re, which enables those at high flood risk to access that level of cover, and that's helped over 300,000 homes since it was launched. Paul, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge challenge for insurers, but perhaps more importantly to customers. And it's not just about bricks and mortar. I mean, that can be reinstated, but, we see precious possessions are lost as well. I remember going up to Carlisle back in 2005 and see row and row of skipped mementos and pictures, absolutely awful to witness. So we can't forget the mental health ramifications of all this. And there's some studies which show that people can suffer from symptoms akin to PTSD as well. And Zurich recently launched a support offering to customers, free counselling services in the aftermath of these sort of events. And if you look beyond domestic customers and think about small businesses, businesses that have already suffered since the pandemic, added to that worry, those in flood zones are now keeping their fingers crossed every time there's prolonged bouts of rain. So it's a really serious issue for both domestic customers and businesses too.
Yeah, thanks, Laura and Paul. It's really important, isn't it, that we don't just contemplate the high-level statistics, although they are really important, but place the devastating human impact that flooding can cause your customers at front and centre of our conversation. And Laura, in a pre-COVID world, how high did the issue of flooding sit on the government's agenda, and where do you think that it will sit once the pandemic has passed?
Yeah, so flooding is one of the top hazards on the government's UK risk register, as is pandemics. Generally speaking, flooding's remained a constant issue for government, and they are sadly regularly reminded of those risks every time it floods. The focus does often tend to die down after sort of the cameras have left the scene. It's important to remember the last major event that we had in the UK was actually just before lockdown in February and March 2020, with the impact of storms Ciara, Dennis and George, where insurers paid out over £540 million in claims. Pandemic hasn't removed the threat of flooding for sure, and I think the focus on climate changes and COP26 this year is going to really keep that focus on, and the ABI are going to continue to remind government at every opportunity of the risk being there.
Yeah, COP26 being the UN climate change conference to be held in the UK in November of this year. Let's talk about what's available to us in terms of mitigating flood risk. Paul, what devices are currently available to individuals and businesses who are at flood risk to mitigate that risk?
Yeah, I think with climate change, we need to accept we can't rely any longer purely on infrastructure level defence schemes, and we need to look at individual property level protection. And there's some practical things people can integrate into their properties to make them more resilient, and even an air brick cover, quite modest in cost, can make a difference. But it's also accepted, I think, that some property level measures do require funding. And I think the government could play an important role here. The Prime Minister backs a green Build Back Better recovery, but fixing the broken flood resilience grant system could help. I mean, currently grants are only handed out for resilience after a flood and then only following extreme regional events. And it's a bit like shutting the Thames barrier after a storm, I guess. But we're making these grants available before, not after a flood, could make a real difference. And just one final thing, I think, we're still building homes on floodplains in inappropriate places. We absolutely need more homes in the UK, but crucially too, properties which are resilient.
And Paul, just to add to that on the grants, I heard that government have just launched or are launching a review into how that system works. So it's a great opportunity for us all to feed in and make sure that that gets improved for the future.
Yeah, so there's a responsibility at all levels, isn't it, to mitigate flood risk. And let's turn our attention to the future now. Laura, how do you see the issue of flooding developing into the future?
Certainly, it's not going to be going away anytime soon. We know we're going to see more intense and frequent rainfall and more severe weather events. The Environment Agency have said as well that they know that the number of properties that are going to be in the floodplain are going to double over the next 50 years. And that's really before government's house building agenda has started building significant number of properties in areas of flood risk. So there's going to be a huge number of challenges coming up. We're also going to see the end of flood re in 2039. So those previously not able to get flood cover, we don't know what that will look like. There's a huge number of risks. And I think, at some point we need to start looking and have started looking at allowing that water to enter people's homes and businesses, building them in a resilient way that allows them to dry it out pretty quickly and get their lives back up and running. Paul, I don't know if you've got anything else to add.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that we see a more developed property flood resilience market, really. I mean, Zurich have backed the DEFRA supportive flood resilience roundtable for a few years. It includes the likes of Federation of Small Businesses and flood campaigners. And the whole aim of that is to normalise flood resilience in the built environment. Some great initiatives already followed through, whether that be training more risk surveyors, product installers, looking to introduce kite mark products. But also, I think, crucially, the development of a code of practice which Syria have produced, which is superb. It's all about flood risk assessment and subsequent work. So some real positive stuff going on, and we all need to embrace that and just continue on that journey.
Yeah, you're right, Paul. Let's hope the PFR market, the property flood resilience market, with the support of the roundtable and the likes of the Syria Code of Practice, as you've mentioned, can really be developed well and generate the confidence of end users. Paul, what can we as an industry be doing now to mitigate flood risk?
Well, I think it's partly just continuing to promote an understanding about resilience and the importance of it. What the risks of flooding are, what can be done to reduce them. It's also a sustainability issue as well, of course, that, we're stripping out properties. What can we do to build in resilience? So there's a big element of education and sharing insight here, and also sharing great examples of where resilience has worked. People have got back in their homes quicker, or businesses have not been disrupted at all even. So we need to share more of those stories, and also not to forget that, all of this doesn't just test the physical resilience of buildings, but also the mental resilience of those that live in these properties or those that work in them too.
Absolutely. And I think just to add to that, Paul, it's about insurers learning lessons of every flood event being different and making sure that they understand, what might not have gone as smoothly as possible, and making sure that they create the right approach for their customers. And it's also, looking at certain things like following the floods in Doncaster in 2020, there was an independent flood review that created some recommendations that the industry is taking forward, looking at signposting if they're not able to offer flood cover to someone else who is, and raising awareness of consumer understanding of flood risk. So there's some great steps there, but it's also, as we've talked about that holistic approach of everybody taking ownership and managing the risks. So individuals living at flood risk, also government looking at investment in flood defences and the maintenance of those flood defences, looking at planning reform and things like that. So lots that everybody can do.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Good points. Well made. So as we look to the future, we need to generate an awareness of the risks that flooding actually poses to the UK at any time, not just after an extreme weather event. We also mustn't forget that there's a human cost, there's a human impact to flooding, which can easily hide behind the high-level statistics that we've shared today. And if we collaborate and as we share success stories of the positive impact of PFR and central and local government investment, I hope we can tackle the issue flooding more meaningfully and be positive about the future. Thank you, Laura and Paul, for your really valuable contributions today. We're going to be covering some of the topics that we've discussed today in a bit more detail in future episodes. Next time we'll be discussing PFR. It'd be great to hear your observations and comments on the content of this podcast. So please send them through at propertydamage@blmlaw.com. Thank you for listening to our conversation today, and we look forward to you tuning in for the next episode.